current, everything around you moves. Nothing stands still. In the current, rough stones are smoothed and new paths are formed. In the current, you are led where it leads, not always where you've planned. In the current, you are always on a journey, and the current is the way.
His name wasn't Roger, but for the sake of this story, we'll call him Roger because his name isn't important, his story is. See, you could say, if you knew Roger from the time he was a child, that he was a pretty normal kid. He had a normal life. He had a mom and a dad and a younger sister, and they lived in a nice 3-bedroom home. His life was pretty much normal. Not perfect, but normal. It was a normal life. He was a normal kid. He got into trouble. He was a scoundrel from time to time, but he was a good kid in general. And his life was predictable and safe, and he didn't know any different. Till he was 10 years old. When he was 10 years old, his mom sat he and his younger sister down and said, your father's not going to live with us anymore. He has decided that he wants to start a different life, but we'll be okay. We'll be all right. And Roger was a bit shaken by this, but he had so many friends who had been through this. I mean, he had friends whose families had broken up, and it was ugly and it was awful, and this kind of seemed, okay, I guess that's what happened. And he really didn't carry it as a problem till he was a teenager. As a teenager, and he began to experiment with some things and try some things, and nothing criminal, mind you. But he was a normal adolescent boy, and he was kind of acting out some of the hurt, some of the loss, some of the sense that maybe his family was his fault. But he did okay. He made his way through high school, got good enough grades. He got into a junior college, did a couple of years at junior college, then got into a university, and he decided he wanted to be a banker like his dad. So he studied finance, he studied economics, he got out, and sure enough, he got a job in a bank, and they promised him a bunch of promotions, and over the first 2 years of his professional life, things were going pretty good. He had a nice apartment, and he was making enough money to have a new car, and he reconnected with a girl that he met in college, and they started dating, and things were going really good, and he felt good about it. And then one day he said, why don't we move in together? It'll save us money. And so they moved in together, and after they were living together for a while, he kind of felt like maybe we should make this thing permanent. Now, if you had asked Roger at that time, do you love her? He would have said, probably. Yeah, I think I do. But if you had pressed a little harder, I think you would have found that he loved the idea of being married more than he loved who he was marrying. And it was almost as if he had decided he was going to prove to his father that he could do something his father couldn't. And he was going to build a family that stayed together. And so it didn't take long before they decided it's time to have a kid, and they had a little girl. And his career kept going, and she was an elementary school teacher, and they were raising their daughter, and they bought their first house, and they had a normal life. Not perfect, but a normal life. And he got into his mid-40s, and he got into that place A place where one day just led to the next, and 1 week led to the next, and 1 month led to the next, and it was just, what's the next quarter? And it was quarter after quarter, and while he wouldn't have admitted it, but he felt stuck. It wasn't like he was depressed. It wasn't like he felt bad. He just didn't feel good. He felt sort of a malaise, sort of an apathy toward things. He knew he loved his family. He knew he loved his daughter. His job was okay. It paid well, but he felt like he was on a treadmill that he couldn't get off. And he felt ambiguous about himself and about life. If you met Roger, what would you tell him? What would you tell him that might help him kind of get unstuck? Is there one thing that you could say to Roger to say that there's more for you? That you don't have to stay here. You don't have to be stuck in this sort of endless, monotonous, same after same after same. There's more. What would you say to him? How would he find that? Well, if you're a professional therapist, you might say, well, we're gonna go back and we're gonna revisit that 10-year-old boy. And we're gonna get in touch with the family system that you grew up in that kind of shaped who you are. And we're gonna do some work. We're gonna do some inner work. And maybe you can find yourself out of this malaise because you'll find out that where you are is not your fault. That there are a lot of things going on that you're a product of, but they're not because of you. Maybe if you're a good Christian friend of his, you might say, man, you need to get your butt to church, man. You need some churching up. You need to hang out with people who you can lean on. You need to be able to be around people who are going through life with you. You need to be involved in something that's bigger than yourself. You need to be in the Word. You need to get to know Jesus, because what could it hurt? I mean, this is a resource and it's right there. Maybe that would help you. If you were just perhaps his best friend, you might say, man, I hear you. I get it. I feel the same. I feel the same as you. I think we all do. I think from time to time we all feel like we're just kind of stuck. So you're not alone, brother. All of those things are good things. I think all of those have value. But there's one thing that is probably the hardest thing to say. And it is the hardest thing for someone to accept, but it's the most necessary thing. It's the most important thing. That's what I want to talk about today. What is that thing that is hard for us to say and even harder for us to hear, but it is the most important thing we can know about our own lives? I want to press into that, and I want to find out what it might not be possible for Roger to hear, but we all need to say. But before we press into that, would you pray with me for a moment? Father in heaven, I would ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart would be pleasing in your sight, and that you would use your words spoken by your servant and anointed by your Spirit to challenge us to embrace your grace and to understand what that really means. I need it, and I believe we all do. So I pray that we might hear what you are telling us we need today. For I ask that in Jesus' name, amen. If you were here last week we began a study of an imperfect world. And I put together a list of what a community would look like. What would a community look like if it were perfect? In fact, I asked ChatGPT, what are the top 5 attributes of a perfect community or a perfect society? And ChatGPT, in about a second and a half, gave me a list of the top 5 attributes or the characteristics of a perfect community. But then I asked ChatGPT a second question. I said, well, why is it that a perfect community doesn't exist? What are the top 5 things that keep us from experiencing a perfect community. And in a second and a half, ChatGPT came up with 5 of those. And the first one, I thought ChatGPT nailed it. It said human nature. Basically, it said people are idiots. And that's why we live in an imperfect world. I define it more theologically. It has to do with sin. We're all broken. And the world is imperfect because it is a broken world that we live in. Now, you can take or leave what ChatGPT was saying, but I think ChatGPT missed a very important thing. And it's a theistic proposition. And I don't expect ChatGPT to involve a theistic worldview in its logical and analytical and rational evaluations. But I happen to believe that that theistic point of view is the critical point of view. And the reason that we live in an imperfect world and the reason that we cannot build a perfect community is because we're imperfect. We are perfectly imperfect. Because in a perfect world, you don't need to be generous. You don't need to be kind. You don't need to be loving. If everything's perfect and you have everything you need, you never need to sacrifice. But the world is so perfectly imperfect that we are invited to flourish in our generosity, to make those around us better, because we all need help. We all can use something better, and we can be better, and we can make a difference. It is our purpose. Why do we live in an imperfect world? Because it's perfectly imperfect. And we are given the opportunity to make it better. If the world is perfect, then we can't contribute to making it better. But because it's imperfect, we have to give. We get to give. And what we're looking at theologically is a letter that was written to the church in Austin. Well, not technically Austin, to a city like Austin 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years ago, the city of Austin was located in southern Greece. It was called Corinth. It was a melting pot of a city. It was a city that was populated by creatives and by entrepreneurs and people who wanted to go their own way. It was a different kind of place, a special kind of place. And it attracted people from all over the Roman Empire. And much like Austin, it was an energetic place. And it was a place where a church was planted by the Apostle Paul. And it was a church that struggled with its own imperfections. And so the Apostle Paul wrote 2 letters that are preserved in our Bible to that church in Austin or that church in Corinth. We have them 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And we're looking at a handful of verses in Paul's 2nd letter in the 9th chapter. Last week we looked at verses 6, 7, 8, and 9. And we talked about the need and the opportunity that we have to be generous and how generosity flourishes in an imperfect community. Today, we want to look at verses 10 and 11 of 2 Corinthians chapter 9. And they go like this. Now he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will also supply and increase your store of seed and enlarge or enrich your harvest of righteousness. And you will be enriched in every way so that you can be generous on every occasion, and through us, your generosity will result in thanksgiving or in their thanksgiving to God. Ooh. That just kind of gives you chills, doesn't it? That's one of those verses you just read it and you say, somebody should write a song about this. It's so poetic. Or not. I mean, listen to it again. Maybe it takes a second time for it to sink in, for you to really feel the passion, feel the heart of these verses. Now he who supplies seed for the sower and bread for food will also supply and increase your store of seed and will enlarge your harvest of righteousness. you will be enriched in every way so that you can be generous on every occasion. And through us, your generosity will result in their thanksgiving to God. You feel it yet? No, me neither. I mean, the Bible is filled with poetry and promises and verses that are worth memorizing, the kind of verses you want to get tattooed on your forearm so you see them every day when you wake up. Verses like Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 11. Jeremiah 29:11 says, I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to bring you hope and a future. Yeah, put Jeremiah 29:11 on your wrist. Or Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want. Or John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whosoever should believe in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. What a promise. Or Romans 8:28, all things work together for good to those who love God and are called according to his purpose. Or you want a smaller tattoo? Philippians 4:13. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. These are those poetic, motivational, magical verses that we just cling to in times of desperation. 2 Corinthians 9, 10 and 11, not so much. He who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will also supply and increase your store of seed and will enrich or enlarge your harvest or the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in every way so that you can be generous on every occasion. And through us, your generosity will result in their thanksgiving to God. Not even my theological nerd friends get excited about those verses. And it's because they're like lines of binary code. And unless you understand what they are decoding, you don't realize the power that is contained in those two verses, the promises that are there. Because what 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 10 and 11 is the decryption code for grace. We have the binary code that explains to us what grace is in those two verses. Now, if you've been around Riverbend, if this is your first Sunday, man, am I glad you're here. But the thing you need to know about Riverbend Church is that for 45 years, Riverbend Church has been a place of grace. We champion that model. We champion that motto. It's kind of in our DNA. When we say we are a place of grace, what we mean by that is different, though. And the beauty of the idea of grace is its ambiguity. We use the word grace because it's a placeholder for what we kind of understand, but we don't really know it. It's like a coloring book page in a kid's coloring book. It's just an outline, and we all fill it in with the colors that we think are appropriate. If you were to ask 50 Riverbenders who've been here for 45 years of Sundays to define grace, you would get 50 similar but different answers. Some people would say grace means forgiveness. Some people would say that grace means acceptance. Some would say that grace means patience. Some would say that grace means second chances or new beginnings. Grace means you can begin again. And all of those ideas are within the boundaries of what grace is, but we don't really understand it. The Greek word for grace is the word charis. It appears over 240 times in the New Testament. And it is a word that evolved out of the ancient Semitic languages. The roots of the idea of grace aren't just New Testament roots, even though the Apostle Paul uses the word grace over 100 times in just his epistles. The idea of grace, the concept of grace, goes all the way back to the beginning of human language. In the Semitic languages, some of the oldest languages on earth, the idea of grace has two dimensions. And the first dimension is the Semitic dimension of the idea of grace. And etymologists tell us that from the very first formation of human language, there was an idea of grace. Think of it. And this idea of grace was evolving throughout most of the Semitic languages. You can find the idea of grace in cuneiform texts and in Akkadian texts and Canaanite texts. You can find it in Persian and Babylonian and Assyrian and Greek and Roman cultures. You can find it throughout the ancient Middle East. You can find these ideas of grace, and by the time the Hebrew language started to be written down and formed, probably about 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, there was a word that came to represent grace. It was the word Hanan. But in most of the literature that has been preserved over the years, the word Hanan often appeared with two synonyms. The word Racham, which we often translate mercy, and the word chesed, which we often translate as love. So you understand the nature of grace is associated with mercy and love. But the word Hanan, which is the word that is translated grace in the Hebrew language and in your Hebrew Bible, it is an idea of an action, whereas Racham and chesed are more the emotion, the feeling, the empathy, the sympathy that we associate with grace. The action of grace is the original word, Hanan. You see, Hanan originally meant to stoop down, to bend low. And the image in the ancient Semitic culture was that grace was helping someone up who had fallen down. You see the beauty of that picture? It's the image of grace is an action that says, I will bend down and I will pick you up. But the interesting development in the etymology of the word Hanan is that it appears in the code of conduct for military combat. In the ancient Middle East, perhaps in ancient human history, tribal warfare was very Darwinian. You won a war by killing your enemies. It was that simple. It was a take no prisoners philosophy. You were kill or be killed. And so in the conquest of your neighboring enemies, when you were in battle, the code of conduct in combat meant you kill them before they killed you. And that was it. But the idea of Hanan was introduced in case a warrior came upon someone who was injured and unable to defend themselves. The code of conduct in combat said, you have every right to kill that enemy combatant. That's what you do. You kill your enemies. But if you showed them Hanan, you spared their life. You spared their life because they could not defend themselves or because they were injured. And the qualifier of the rule of Hanan was that person then became your servant because you had given them a new life. You had saved their life and they owed you theirs. Their life was no longer their own. You can't tell Roger that. You can't tell someone who is stuck in the middle of their life that it's not about you, man. It's not about your struggles. It's about you and what you can do for others. It's about grace. It's about you understanding that you have received unqualified, undeserved favor. And you exist to pay that forward. Get over yourself, buddy. But that's hard to say to someone who's stuck on the treadmill. It's even harder for those of us who are in that malaise to hear that it's not about me. It's about what I can do for others. It's about the life that I have that is no longer my own. It's about sacrifice. It's not about success. It's not about accumulation. It's not about having. It's about having to give. One dimension of what charis means, of the idea of grace, is that it is this perspective that I have been given a second chance and I owe my life to the one who gave it to me. I live to serve because my life is not my own. That's grace. But grace is also, in the Greek etymology, it is also a shared root. Charis shares a root with the Greek word chara. And chara literally is translated 242 times in the New Testament as joy. Chara is the word for joy. Almost every time it appears in the Bible, it's either translated as happiness or joy. And that's what concerns me, is that we have a diluted or a mutated view of what joy is. We think joy is just happiness on steroids. Joy is just turbocharged happiness. If I am super happy, then I'm joyful. That joy is this thing beyond happy. There's good, and then there's happy, and then there's joy. And joy is the highest order of happiness. You can't steal my joy, brother. Joy is its own thing. And the interesting thing is that joy is more than just happiness. Chara is more than just happiness. It's really more like satisfaction, more like contentment. There's a story that Jesus tells in Matthew chapter 25. It's called the parable of the talents. And in that story, Jesus talks about a rich man who divides his wealth among 3 of his servants. Remember the story? He gives one 5 talents, he gives one 3 talents, and he gives another 1 talent. A talent was a year's wages. And he goes off on a long journey. And the parable says that each of them, the first 2, the one with 5 and the one with 3, invested their talents. And when the master eventually returned, they repaid their master not just the talents that they had been entrusted with, but the interest that they had earned. And in Matthew chapter 25, verses 23 and 25, he responds to the 5-talent servant and the 3-talent servant exactly the same way. He says, "Well done, my good and faithful servant. You have been faithful in the little things. Now enter into the larger things. Come and enter into my Karan. Enter into my joy. Enter into my contentment, my satisfaction with a job well done." Living in an imperfect world, we realize one horrifying thing. It's never perfect. It's never done. But it is possible, Kara tells us, and grace tells us, it's possible that when we serve, and we serve with our best, and we offer our best, that is what it means to be well done. That is what it means to be satisfied and content. That I have done my best. I have given my best. Not what was left, not the rest, but I have given my best. It is hard to tell Roger this. It's hard to tell anyone who is stuck in the treadmill of life. Not just to mail it in, but you need to give your best. You need to do your best. But this is what grace does. If we are a church of grace, and Riverbend claims to be, and I believe we are pursuing being a place of grace, that means we are a place who understands that our life is not our own. We have been given a second chance. We have been given a fresh start. We can begin again because of the promise of a forgiving and loving God. And we have the capacity to offer our best to make an imperfect world, an imperfect community, an imperfect church better. That's what it means to be a people of grace. You see, I believe that generosity flourishes in an imperfect world. Listen to 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 10 and 11. one more time. Understanding that it is decrypting for us what grace is. It begins by saying, he who supplies. Who is the he? He is God. It literally says the one. Should be capital H, he. He is the one who supplies the seed to the sower, who even allows you to sow the seed, and the bread for food. He supplies our daily bread. Sound familiar? And he also supplies and increases our potential, our opportunities, our store of seed, so that we might enlarge the harvest of our righteousness. Think of the harvest of righteousness as the accumulation of the things that we did that made the lives of other people better. And all of that is sourced in him. See, if you look at the pronouns, you start to see that it begins with he sowed the seed for your, or for my sowing of seeds, and for my bread, and for my storehouse of seeds, and for my harvest of righteousness. It all comes from him. And then he says, you will be enriched in every way so that you can be generous on every occasion. And through us, through all of our efforts, by being a family of grace, a place of grace, we will result in that the people who we serve, thank God, and their lives are better. It is the formula for generosity. It is the formula for grace. It is perfect in an imperfect world. I asked ChatGPT, why is it that we can't have a perfect society? What are the top 5 reasons why a perfect society or a perfect community doesn't exist? And it gave me 5 reasons that were reasonable, but it missed the point, because it missed what God is doing. What God is doing is God is creating in us the opportunity for generosity, the opportunity for grace. It's interesting to me how many people I meet are like Roger. They find themselves at a place in their life where they feel stuck. And if I had psychological training, or if they had a therapist who could help them sort through the issues of their childhood and their family systems and sort through who they are, I'm sure that would be helpful. And it would be helpful if they had a Christian friend who said, come with me to church and invest your life in a group of people who can walk with you and develop your faith. That's an asset. Why wouldn't you want that? And I would say to him as a friend, yeah, I get it. We all feel that way from time to time. But the hardest thing to tell him and the hardest thing to hear is what you need is more grace. You need to realize that your life is not your own, and that grace can bring you contentment, and you can be satisfied. See, you all realize this was not a story about Roger. This was a story about us in a place of grace.